Her father, the town preacher, declared the price was 3 barrels of whiskey and a new wagon wheel. A generous sum, he said, for a daughter cursed with the devil's mark. At 19, Elara Croft believed her life was over. A shameful burden to be handed off to the grieving widower of Whisper Creek Canyon, a man who lived in the ashes of his own past. She was traded from one prison to another expecting a monster. But what she found was a man even more broken than she was. Hello and welcome to Frontier Rescue Stories. This is a story of how a mark of shame can become a mark of beauty, and how 2 shattered souls, lost in the wilderness, can find a way to rescue each other. Before we journey into that lonely canyon, please help our stories reach all those who need to hear them by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel, and sharing this video with someone who needs a story of hope. And we love to know where our stories are traveling. Let us know in the comments below, from what part of the world are you watching today? The town of Redemption Gulch was dying of thirst. The creek had slowed to a muddy trickle. The sky was a sheet of relentless pale brass, and the crops had turned to brown dust in the fields. For this suffering, the town had one person to blame, Elara Croft. Elara was 19, and she was the preacher's daughter, but she was no child of God, at least, not according to her father. She had been born with the devil's mark, a deep port wine stain that covered her left cheek and the skin around her temple, a constellation of deep crimson that her father, Preacher Croft, had declared a brand of original sin. He was a man who ruled his town through fear, his voice a hammer from the pulpit, and his daughter was his greatest sermon. He used her as a walking testament to the sin that plagued their community. "Behold the mark of the curse," he would thunder. "Behold why the rains have abandoned us." Elara's life was a study in shadows. She moved through the town like a ghost, her head down, her hair pulled low to cover her face. The townsfolk would not meet her eyes. They would cross the street to avoid her, whispering and making signs with their fingers to ward off the evil they believed she carried. Her own father never addressed her unless it was to bark an order, and he never ever touched her. Her mother, a gentlewoman who had once called the mark Elara's rose blossom, had died of fever years ago, leaving Elara alone with the preacher's cold, righteous cruelty. His hatred was a tangible presence in their cramped cabin, a cold that no hearth fire could ever truly banish. He believed Elara's flaw was an insult to his piousness, a walking reminder of the weakness he saw in her mother. But the shame that was forced upon her had not killed the kindness in her heart. Elara had a secret. Behind the ramshackle church, hidden by a stand of dying aspens, she tended a small, struggling garden. She would sneak water from the preacher's private well, drop by precious drop, to nurture a few rows of hardy beans, squash, and wild herbs. It was a place of impossible life in the middle of all that dust. She didn't grow it for herself. She grew it for the town's forgotten creatures, the stray dogs and cats that were starving. It was her one act of defiance, her one connection to the mother who had taught her to make things grow. But her father found it. He stood over the little patch of green, his face like a thundercloud. He called it vanity and a witch's garden. With his heavy boots, he crushed the plants, grinding the green leaves into the dry, cracked earth until nothing remained. As the drought worsened and the town's mood soured from desperation to anger, Preacher Croft knew he had to make a final decisive act. He would not just punish the curse, he would purge it from their lands entirely. He had found a way to cast out the blight. The solution to Preacher Croft's problem arrived in the form of a man named Jedediah, a fur trapper who supplied the remote, isolated homesteads in the high canyons. Jedediah was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, a man who traded in necessities and didn't much care for the politics of towns. He rode into Redemption Gulch leading a pack mule, intending to trade pelts for whiskey and flour. He found the preacher waiting for him on the edge of the settlement. Elara, sent to fetch firewood, overheard the transaction from behind the woodshed, the harsh haggling voices carrying on the dry air. "She is 19, her father's voice rasped, strong and quiet. "She will keep a house and not be a burden of conversation." Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco onto the dust. "Preacher, the man I supply ain't looking for a wife. He ain't looking for anything but to be left alone." "The man's haunted. He is a man, isn't he?" Croft pressed. "Even a haunted man has needs. A clean floor, a hot meal. She can provide it, and she will not complain. Silas Thorne is a broken man. What he needs is peace, not a girl to care for." "She will be no trouble," her father assured him. "A small price for her keep. 3 barrels of your whiskey and that new wagon wheel you have." Elara's blood ran cold. The price of her life? Whiskey and a wheel. Jedediah was silent for a long time. He looked from the desperate, wild-eyed preacher to the town, which felt like a tinderbox ready to explode. He knew of Silas Thorne's loneliness, and he knew of the preacher's cruelty. 1 barrel of whiskey, Jedediah countered. And the wheel. And I take her now. I'm heading up to Whisper Creek Canyon at dawn. Done, the preacher said, a chilling satisfaction in his voice. You have bought yourself a servant. Elara shrank back, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She was property, a thing to be bought and sold. That evening her father grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a vice. He shoved her toward the small stable where Jedediah was preparing his mule. You will go with this man, he sneered. A haunted man is a fitting match for a haunted girl. Perhaps the wilderness will finish what God intended. He didn't look at her again. He simply turned and walked back toward his church, his shoulders straight. A man who had successfully purged his home of its deepest sin. Elara was left standing in the dirt, her small bundle of belongings in her hand, as the trapper who now owned her gestured grimly toward the pack mule. Her journey into the unknown had begun. The journey began in a heavy, oppressive silence. Jedediah was not a man for small talk, and Elara had been taught that her voice was a sin. For 3 days they climbed, leaving the dusty, dying plains of Redemption Gulch behind for the high, rocky canyons of the frontier. The world changed around her. The air grew thinner, cleaner. Great, silent pines stood like sentinels, and the sky was a deep, aching blue she had only ever seen in paintings. It was beautiful, and its beauty terrified her. She was a lamb being led to a slaughter she couldn't comprehend, her father's words echoing in her mind, painting a picture of the haunted man who awaited her. On the 3rd night, they made camp under a massive rock overhang. The stars were so close, they looked like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. Jedediah, perhaps seeing the raw fear in her eyes, finally spoke. He handed her a tin cup of hot coffee and sighed, poking the fire with a stick. You're scared, he stated. You think he's a monster. Elara flinched but didn't deny it. He ain't a monster, girl, Jedediah said, his voice rough. He's just a ghost. The man you're going to... His name is Silas Thorne. He wasn't always like this. He was a good man, a proud man. Built the finest ranch in this territory with his own 2 hands, right there in Whisper Creek Canyon. He had a wife, Anna, and a little boy, Thomas. He adored them. He truly did. He paused, his gaze lost in the fire. 2 years ago, a wildfire came down the canyon like a roaring river of flame. It came so fast. Silas was in the high pasture miles away, rounding up strays. By the time he saw the smoke, by the time he got back, Jedediah shook his head, the memory heavy on him. He tried, girl. Lord knows he tried. But he lost them both. Lost the house, the barns, everything. He lost his whole world in an afternoon. Elara sat frozen, the cup trembling in her hands. This wasn't the story of a monster. It was the story of a man who had suffered a pain she couldn't even imagine. He lives in the ashes, Jedediah continued quietly. He never rebuilt the main house. He just stays in the old bunkhouse alone. I'm the only one he'll trade with. He don't talk. He just exists. He's haunted, all right, but not by demons. He's haunted by them. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a sad pity. I don't know why your father did this to you, girl. And I don't know what will happen when we get there. Silas didn't ask for you. But he's not a cruel man. He's just empty. As Elara tried to sleep that night, her fear of a monster was replaced by a strange, hollow ache. She was a girl marked by a curse she didn't understand, being sent to a man who had been marked by a fire he could not escape. They arrived at Whisper Creek Canyon as sun was setting, painting high canyon walls in shades of blood orange and violet. The place was beautiful, a hidden emerald valley with a creek that truly did seem to whisper as it ran over smooth stones. But in center of that beauty was a scar. The main ranch house was just as Jedediah had described, blackened skeleton of a large, proud home. The stone chimneys stood like tombstones against sky. The barns were gone, just burnt foundations. It was a graveyard of a life. A little ways off, standing untouched, was a long, sturdy bunkhouse, built of thick logs. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. As they approached, a man emerged from the bunkhouse. He was tall, taller than her father, with a lean, powerful build that spoke of hard work. He wore simple buckskin pants and a worn shirt. His dark hair was long, and his face was carved with lines of both strength and a quiet, settled sorrow. It was his eyes that held her. They were deep and dark and utterly hollow. This was Silas Thorne. He didn't speak. He just looked at Jedediah, then his gaze moved to Elara. He saw her face, his eyes passing over her birthmark without any change in expression. No disgust, no pity, no anger, nothing. That absolute lack of reaction was more shocking to Elara than any insult. He simply saw her. Jedediah dismounted. "Silas," he said, his voice careful. "This is Elara Croft, her father, preacher in Redemption Gulch. He sent her as payment for the supplies." Silas stared at Elara for a long, silent moment. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting to be turned away, to be cursed, to be beaten. He finally turned to Jedediah. He handed him a small pouch of coins. "Unload supplies," he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone, rusty from disuse. Jedediah did as he was told, unloaded barrels and the wheel, and left as quickly as he could, not wanting to be caught in the fallout. Elara was left alone, standing in the dust, as Silas Thorne stared at her. "The preacher, he sold you," Silas said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Elara could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He seemed to think for a moment, then pointed 100 yards away to a small, separate line cabin set under the pines. It was clean and sturdy with its own small porch. "You will sleep there," he said, his voice flat. "There is food in the main storehouse. You will cook. Leave my meal on the porch of bunkhouse. Do not enter my house, and do not go near the ruins." He looked at burnt-out shell of his home, and a shadow of such profound pain crossed his face that Elara instinctively took a step back. Without another word, he turned, walked back into bunkhouse, and shut the door. Elara stood in the deepening twilight, alone in a canyon with a ghost. But for the first time in her entire life, she was also alone in a space that was hers. She had a door she could close, a place she could be safe. A new life began, governed by a silent contract. Elara woke in her small cabin before dawn, the air crisp and cold. She would go to the storehouse, a small, well-stocked cellar dug into the hillside, and take what she needed: flour, bacon, coffee, beans. She would prepare breakfast and leave a plate on the wooden porch of the bunkhouse. She would knock once, then walk away. Hours later, the empty plate would be there. At dusk, she would do the same for supper. She never saw him. She only heard him. The ring of an axe splitting wood in the forest. The distant nicker of his horse. The scrape of a tool being mended in the barn. In this profound silence, Elara began to breathe. This was not the brittle, angry silence of her father's house, heavy with judgment and the threat of a blow. This was a quiet, watchful peace. Silas Thorne left her utterly alone. He demanded nothing of her but the meals, and in return, he gave her the greatest gift she had ever known: safety. She was not a curse here. She was not a burden. She was nothing, and nothing felt like a blessing. She spent her days exploring. She found the creek, fished in it with a simple line she'd made. She learned the paths of the deer. The bunkhouse was his space. The line cabin was hers. But the ruins were a place of an unspoken shared sorrow. She respected his rule and stayed away from the blackened timbers. But from a distance near the foundation, she saw it. A small stone-lined garden, now completely overgrown with weeds and scorched thistles. It had been Anna's garden. Elara could see the ghosts of what it had been: patches of wild herbs, hardy mountain flowers, and a stubborn, thorny stalk that looked like it might have been a rose bush. The sight of it, a place of life suffocated by ash and neglect, resonated with something deep inside Elara. It felt like her own hidden garden, the one her father had destroyed. A quiet resolve formed in her. She would not let this place die too. Slowly, cautiously, she began to work. She didn't go near the ruins themselves, but she walked to the edge of the stone-lined plot. She pulled a few weeds. The next day, she brought water from the creek and poured it at the base of the thorny rose stalk. It was an act of respect, a quiet apology to the woman whose life had been consumed by the fire. She was tending a grave, but also planting a seed of hope. From the window of the bunkhouse, hidden in the shadows, Silas watched her. He watched her gentle hands clear the weeds, watched her bring water, watched her kneel in the dirt that had once belonged to his wife. And his face, which had been a mask of stone for 2 years, was unreadable. The seasons began to turn. The quiet routine of meals left on porches and distant Silent work continued for weeks. Elara's garden began to show faint signs of life. The rosebush even sprouted a few new green leaves. Silas continued to watch her, his presence a constant, silent weight at the edge of her world. The distance between the bunkhouse and the line cabin felt like a mile-wide canyon of grief and silence. It would take an act of nature to force them to cross it. The blizzard came with no warning. One afternoon, the brassy sky turned a sickly gray, and the wind began to howl. Not as a whisper, but as a scream. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal sheet. Elara, safe in her cabin, stoked her small fire, her heart pounding with a primal fear. The storm was a living thing, an angry spirit trying to tear the world apart. She thought of Silas. He had ridden out that morning to check on a newborn calf in the high pasture. As dusk fell and the storm reached its peak, Elara paced her small room, straining to see through the whiteout. Then she saw him. A dark shape, staggering through the impossible wind, his horse nowhere to be seen. It was Silas, carrying the half-frozen calf in his arms. He was limping badly, favoring his left leg. He made it to the edge of the burnt ruins when a gust of wind, shrieking like a banshee, tore a loose charred beam from the main chimney. Elara watched in horror as the heavy timber cartwheeled through the air and struck Silas, catching him in the leg and sending him down into a snowdrift. He didn't get up. Elara forgot her father's rules. She forgot Silas's rules. She only saw a man, the only man who had shown her a shred of decency. About to die in the cold, she tied a rope around her waist, secured the other end to her cabin's doorframe, and plunged into the storm. The wind stole her breath, the snow blinding her. She found him half-buried, semi-conscious, the calf still held tightly against his chest. "Leave it," she screamed over the wind. "No," he grunted, his voice barely a whisper. She had to fight him, dragging both man and calf, step by agonizing step, back toward the bunkhouse. It was closer than her cabin. She kicked open the door, pulled them both inside, and slammed it shut, barring it against the raging storm. She was in his space. The taboo was broken. He was pale, his leg bleeding from a deep, ugly gash where the burnt wood had torn it open. He was already shivering violently, the fever setting in. Elara was alone in his space, but she was not idle. Elara was alone in his space, but she was not idle. The bunkhouse was a fortress of solitude. It was clean, sparse, and intensely masculine. A single bed, a table, a cold hearth, and shelves of tools. But Elara saw none of it. She only saw a man shivering on floor. She managed to drag him to his bed, covering him with every blanket she could find. The calf, weak but alive, she placed in a box near hearth. Her first priority was the fever. His leg was bad. Gash was deep, and edges were blackened with soot and infection. She knew what to do. Her mother had been a healer, and she had passed on her knowledge. "Some plants hold memory of life," her mother used to say. Elara stoked the fire until it roared. Then she braved storm again, just long enough to get to her own cabin and retrieve dried herbs she had gathered from Anna's garden. She returned, her face numb with cold, and set to work. For 2 days, blizzard raged, trapping them inside. For 2 days, Silas Thorne was lost in a different storm. He was delirious, caught in inferno that had taken his family. He thrashed in the bed, his eyes wide and unseeing, his hands reaching for ghosts. "Anna!" he would cry out, his voice raw with a pain that tore Elara's heart. "Thomas, I'm coming." I can't reach you." He would fight the blankets, thinking they were flames. The fire. "It's so hot. I couldn't save them." "I'm sorry." Elara did not leave his side. She bathed his face with snowmelt. She forced bitter, healing tease between his chapped lips. She held him down when he thrashed. Her own quiet voice a steady anchor in his nightmare. "You're safe, Silas," she would murmur over and over. "The fire is gone. You are safe." She was no longer a ghost in his world. She was his guardian. On the third morning, the storm outside broke. The world was silent, muffled in a deep, pristine white. Elara, exhausted, was dozing in a chair by the bed when she felt his eyes on her. She looked up. He was lucid. His fever was gone. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. He just stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. He seemed to be processing everything. Her presence in his room, the bandage on his leg, the sleeping calf by the fire. He looked at her, and his gaze traveled to her face, to the birthmark she had long forgotten to hide. He slowly, painfully lifted a hand. Elara flinched, her body instinctively coiling, bracing for the blow that in her world always followed such intense scrutiny. but his hand was gentle. He didn't touch her. He just hovered his fingers over her cheek, tracing the shape of the mark in the air. "The fire," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. It marked you too." Elara froze. All her life, her mark had been a curse. But in that moment, this broken man, fresh from the hell of his own memories, looked at her flaw and didn't see sin. He saw a shared survival. He saw himself. The 19 years of shame she had carried, the weight of her father's hatred began to crack. The blizzard had passed, leaving the canyon transformed, buried in a deep, cleansing white. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer the cold, empty silence of two strangers. It was a shared quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding of what had passed between them. Silas was weak, but the fever was gone, and his leg, thanks to Elara's care, was healing. The infection had retreated. Elara continued to cook for him, but now she didn't leave the plate on the porch. She brought it inside, and for the first time, they ate in the same room. He watched her as she moved, his gaze no longer hollow. He was seeing her. He saw the quiet competence of her hands, the strength in her slender frame, the gentle way she tended the calf he had saved. He, who had walled himself off from all living things, had been saved by this girl his mind had barely registered. "Jedediah was wrong," Silas said one afternoon, his voice still rough. Elara looked up from the broth she was stirring. "He said you were haunted, but you are the least haunted person I have ever met." "My father says I'm a curse," she whispered, the old shame still close to the surface. "Your father," Silas said, his voice hardening, "is a blind fool. He wouldn't know grace if it saved his life." As Silas regained his strength, he began to walk with a cane. The first place he went, with Elara at his side, was not the barn but the small, stone-lined garden. The snow had melted, and the wild rose bush she had tended was resilient, its green leaves bright against the dark earth. They stood there for a long time, side by side. He finally spoke, his voice low, telling her the full story. He told her about Anna, about her laugh, about how she had planted this very garden with her own hands. He told her about Thomas, his son, who had his mother's eyes. He told her about the lightning strike that had started the fire, about being in the barn, about the smell of smoke, and the horrifying speed of the flames. "I heard them," he said, his voice breaking. "I heard Anna scream my name. And then I didn't. I haven't spoken of this to anyone." "I know," Elara said softly, touching her own marked cheek. "I know what it's like to be trapped in a fire." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new, raw emotion. He had been a ghost, haunting the ruins of his past. But this quiet, steady girl, with her own visible scars, had walked into his nightmare and let him out. He saw her not as a broken thing, not as a replacement, but as his equal. She, who had been sold for whiskey, had given him back his life. In the quiet of the canyon, in the shared space of that healing garden, two souls, marked by very different fires, began to live again. Their new life was fragile, but it was real. The bunkhouse and the cabin were no longer separate worlds. They shared meals. They spoke. Silas began to teach Elara how to track, how to read the clouds. She, in turn, brought life back to his home, not just with her care, but with her quiet, steady presence. The hollow look in his eyes was replaced by a watchful warmth. He had started to smile, small, rusty smiles that felt like a miracle. The garden was flourishing, and with it, something new and hopeful was taking root in the ashes of his past. But the past was not finished with either of them. The shadow returned to the canyon not as a storm, but as a rider. It was Jedediah, the trapper, and he was riding his horse hard. He galloped into the clearing, his face grim. "Silas, Elara!" "You need to prepare." Elara's heart seized. "What is it?" "It's your father, girl," Jedediah said, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "The drought in Redemption Gulch. It never broke. It's worse than ever. The town is starving and they've gone mad." Silas stepped onto the porch, his hand already resting on the rifle he kept there. "Get to the point, Jed." "The preacher. He's convinced them," Jedediah said, breathing hard. "He told them the drought didn't end because the curse wasn't destroyed. He said you just moved it, that your sin is still poisoning the land from up here in this canyon." "That's insane," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "It's more than insane, it's dangerous," Jedediah warned. "He's whipped a small band of his most loyal zealots into a holy frenzy. They're not just talk, Silas. They're riding here now. I saw them at the pass. About 6 of them, and they're carrying torches and rifles," Jedediah, looked at Elara with terrible pity. They're not coming to talk. They're coming to cleanse the sin with holy fire. They're coming to take you back, girl, and I reckon they mean to burn you as a witch. The blood drained from Elara's face. Her father. He wasn't content to just sell her. He was coming to destroy her. The old cold terror gripped her, and she stumbled back. But Silas's hand was on her shoulder, steady and firm. He was no longer a ghost. He was the master of this canyon, and he was a man with something to protect. He looked at Jedediah. Ride out. Get clear. This is not your fight. He then turned to Elara, his eyes cold as steel. Go to the bunkhouse. Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. He checked his rifle. His movements calm and deliberate. The man who had been hollowed out by grief was now filled with a righteous, protective fury. Elara did as Silas told her, her hands shaking so badly she could barely slide the heavy wooden bar into place. She ran to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched as Silas took his position on the porch, his rifle resting easily in his arms. He was not a man hiding. He was a guardian standing sentinel. It was less than an hour later when they arrived. 6 men, led by her father, Preacher Croft, rode into the clearing. They held torches that smoked in the bright afternoon light, a grotesque parody of a holy procession. They looked wild, their eyes burning with a zealot's fire. Silas Thorne, her father bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. You harbor a witch. You have given sanctuary to the devil's spawn, and now you will pay the price. Silas did not move. He just watched them, his silence more intimidating than any shout. This is my land, preacher. Silas's voice boomed, calm and deadly. You are not welcome here. Turn your men around and ride out. We come on God's errand. Another man shouted, raising his rifle. To purge this land of the curse she brings. She is my daughter. Preacher Croft screamed, his face purple with rage. She is my sin to cleanse. Send out the witch, that we may purify this land with holy fire. The only sin I see here, preacher, Silas replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, is a father who would sell his own child. You have no rights here. Then we will take her by force. Croft shrieked, and he raised his torch, signaling his men to advance. Inside the bunkhouse, Elara's terror was suffocating. She was hiding again, just as she had hidden her whole life. She watched the man who had shown her kindness prepare to fight for her, to die for her, and she watched her father, the man who had caused all her pain, lead a mob to destroy her. Something inside her, something that had been coiled and silent for 19 years, finally snapped. She would not hide. Not anymore. She slid the bar back and opened the door. She stepped out of the shadows and walked onto the porch, to stand beside Silas, not behind him. The men stopped, surprised to see her. I am not a witch, father, Elara said, her voice shaking but carrying with a clear, sudden strength. I am not a curse. I am your daughter. She touched her cheek, the mark her father had taught her to despise. This is just my face. Blasphemy! Croft roared, pointing at her. She is stained. She is marked. She is stained. Her father's voice echoed a final damning judgment. The men raised their rifles, their faces twisted in a mask of righteous hatred, ready to follow their leader's command. Elara flinched, but she did not retreat. She had stood by Silas, and now he stood by her. Silas Thorne took one slow step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elara. He was no longer the hollow ghost of the canyons. He was the master of this land, a protector, and his fury was as cold and vast as the mountains themselves. He looked at Preacher Croft, not at his torch or his rifle, but directly into his eyes. You are the one who is blind. Preacher, Silas said, his voice not loud, but carrying with such authority that the men faltered. Then he did something that stunned every man there, in front of her father, in front of the mob. Silas turned to Elara. He gently, publicly, reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the port wine stain with a tenderness that was more powerful than any weapon. Elara's breath caught. It was the first time in her life a man had touched her mark with anything but disgust. You call this a devil's mark? Silas said, his voice soft for her, but his eyes locked on Croft. I see the color of a wild rose at sunset. I see the map of the fire that we both survived. You look at her and see a curse. He turned his gaze back to the mob, his voice hardening into a deadly command. I look at her and I see an angel. You cast her out and she found her way here. She saved my life. He raised his rifle. its barrel steady and aimed directly at the preacher's heart. You are not welcome in this place. You will not harm her. You will not speak her name. This is your first and final warning. Leave this canyon now, or be buried in it. The confrontation was over. The preacher's righteous fire was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of Silas Thorne's promise. The mob, their zealotry broken by this man who saw beauty in a curse, looked at each other, then at their leader. Preacher Croft, defeated and humiliated, his power broken, stared at his daughter, truly seeing her for the first time, not as his property, but as a woman standing protected by a man who would kill for her. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode away. The others followed, their torches lowered, their retreat shameful. Elara and Silas were left standing in the quiet canyon, the threat finally and forever gone. They stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dust from the riders settle in the distance. The canyon was theirs again. Elara was trembling, the adrenaline fading, leaving her weak. I was sold, she whispered, the old shame still a persistent echo. By law, I am your property. Silas turned to her. He took her hands, his grip firm and warm. No, he said, his voice full of a new fierce emotion. You were never my property. You were my rescue. He looked at her, his eyes tracing the mark on her face. But this time he was smiling. Your father was right about one thing. You are a haunted girl, but so am I, and I think our ghosts can learn to live together. He led her from the porch, not to the bunkhouse and not to her cabin, but to the small, stone-lined garden. The wild rosebush was in full glorious bloom. This is your home, Elara, he said, his voice soft. This is our home. If you will choose to stay with me, I have nowhere else to go, she said. No, he said, gently lifting her chin so she had to meet his eyes. That is not why you should stay. Jedediah will be back. You could go to any town. You are free. He took a breath. Stay because you are wanted, Elara. Stay because you are loved. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a kind she had never known. They were not tears of pain or shame, but of release. She, Elara Croft, the girl with the devil's mark, was loved. I will stay, she said, her voice clear and strong. She was not a bought bride. She was not a servant. She was his equal, his partner. Silas smiled, a true, deep smile that reached his eyes and erased the last of the shadows. He had brought a small sapling with him on his last trip with Jedediah, a new wild rose, its blossoms the same deep crimson as the mark on her cheek. He had kept it hidden, waiting. He took her hand, and together they knelt in the rich, dark earth of Anna's garden. They planted the new rose right beside the one that had survived the fire, their hands touching in the soil, mixing the ashes of the past with the promise of a new, shared future. Thank you for joining us for this story on Frontier Rescue Stories. Elara and Silas prove that the marks we carry, whether on our skin or on our hearts, do not define our worth. True redemption is found when someone has the courage to see the beauty that others have overlooked. If this story of love, survival, and redemption touched your heart, please show your support by giving it a like and sharing it with others who enjoy tales of the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story of hope from our channel. We have many other stories of rescue and redemption, just like this one, waiting for you in our channel playlist. We invite you to click and watch the next one. What part of this story moved you the most? Do you have a story of your own about overcoming judgment and finding your own strength? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from our community. From all of us here at Frontier Rescue Stories, we wish you peace, strength, and a wonderful day.